Alright, so welcome back. So my goal is to build up this buttons and labels view controller. So things start off in the storyboard. So we're going to add some widgets and then we'll start adding some code. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be adding things to this yellow view controller. And what I'm ultimately going to be doing is I'm going to be connecting this to code. Let's go ahead and make the files that we're going to be connecting it to in the code first, just so we can kind of get that out of the way. So what I want to do is I'm going to right click on my project, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to create a new iOS Swift file. And typically what you do is you'll put each view controller into its own file, but you don't actually have to. So what I'm going to do is because this is a simple demo, I'm just going to make one called Detailed View Controllers, and then I'm just going to put all three of them into that area, which isn't necessarily best practice, but it's fine for what I'm wanting to do here. So instead of importing Foundation, I want to import UIKit, and I'm just going to make three classes: Buttons and Labels View Controller, and it's going to be a subclass of UI View Controller. And then I'm just going to copy that, and I'm going to paste it 2 more times on here. And the second one, I'm going to make it be called Touches View Controller. Ooh, that made me realize I have a typo over in my main storyboard. I think I called it Touches without the E. Let me fix that. Don't want to embarrass myself on the first day. And then the bottom one is going to be let's call it Student Table View Controller. And he's actually going to be a subclass of a table view controller because he's going to be a little bit different. So these are going to be my 3 classes. Again, those would usually be different files, but I'm sticking them in the same file because it's going to be such a simple little app, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this top guy, and I'm going to let him know he's not just any old view controller. He is a buttons and labels view controller. I'm going to click on the second guy and tell him, hey, he's not any old view controller. He's a touches view controller. And then, of course, I'm going to click on the bottom one, and I'm going to tell him he's not just any old table view controller. He's a student table view controller. And as soon as I'm ready to start adding code, the fact that I've made these connections is going to be very, very useful. So what we want to do this time is we want to actually just start with the first view controller, and we want to start adding things. When you add things, you just come down, make sure you've got the object library selected, and you just start typing what it is you want to do. So what I want to do is I want to put a button on here, and then below the button I'm going to put a label, and I'm going to choose to drop them such that they're right in the middle, which is going to be great, but I'm going to need to do some more modifying. And instead of dragging on the next button, I'm actually going to make some changes to this top one and then copy it. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to start making some changes to these guys. So instead of saying button, I want it to say, count up. And you can see that once I changed the size, it got all messed up for the box. I'm actually going to bump up the font size to, I don't know, 24 or something like that. And you can see that that became a real disaster. One thing you can do is you can make it match the size by hitting Command equals, and that'll do it. But to be honest, I might choose to make it a little bit bigger than that. So I'm going to drop that to right to the middle of my screen. The label will do some of the same things. I'll bump the font size up. I'll make it start off by saying count equals 0. And then him, to be honest, if it just fits, that's fine. Except for the fact that I do want to make it a little bigger just in case, somebody gets into the hundreds on their counts. And I would actually prefer him to be centered inside his view and then also sit centered in the page as well. Then the last thing I want to do is I just want to make a copy of this button, so I'm just going to drag it down and hold down Option. If I hold down Option, what that'll do is it'll make a copy of it instead of just moving it. And I'm going to make that one say Countdown. So that's all well and good. I've got a lot of good things going on here. If you were to run it right now, it would look like a disaster. We could run it, but instead I'm going to just show you with the tool called the Preview. So I'm going to open up the Assistant Editor. And instead of looking at a code, I'm going to look at the preview. And you can see if you look at these two things side by side that, we kind of thought that we were putting it in the middle, but if we actually were to run it, it would look like this. And if you want to, you can run it. You can prove that to yourself. So here I've got it up, and here I run it. And it looks a little bit different than my preview here. And that's because this preview right here is for an iPhone 4-inch. In fact, you can add a bunch of different things to your preview. So if I wanted to see what would it look like on a 5-inch, I can look at that, and you can see that it fits a little bit more. But ultimately, the story is that I don't want what's going on here, right? What I really want to be doing is I want to be setting constraints so that these things are actually centered. So right now, by default, it lets you kind of put things on here, but without constraints. Previously, there were ways that you could make it look like an iPhone, and then you could just drop things on with absolute layout. There are too many sizes now, right? So there are 4 iPhones, and then there are, 2 iPads. There's just too many sizes, so you have to use constraints now. So what I'm going to do with constraints is there's a number of ways to add constraints. One way is to actually right-click on the element, and then to drag over to a thing you'd like to make the constraint to. So here I'm just going to drag it over to the super view, and then it's going to ask me, what do you want for your constraint here? I'm going to say, oops, I wanted to center horizontally. It looks like if I drag to the right, that wasn't there. I actually should move it straight up, and that should give me a center horizontally in container. So once I say center horizontally in container, you can actually see that it moved. It actually moved it to the top as well, which is no good. So now I want to add another constraint. So I can right-click on this, and I can actually add a top space to the layout guide, and then that would take care of that fix. And you can actually watch it move in your preview over here. So now you can see that count up is kind of in the right spot. It's got these orange lines around it because it says that there's still some other things that are kind of like not constrained about it. It turns out that the constraint that it's complaining about here is the width and height that I've set. If I wanted to fix these, I could come down and I could go to this pen area. And when you click on pen, it should bring up a box that looks like this. And so I'm just going to add a constraint for the width and for the height of just whatever it is, right? Like I suppose if they're really close to an official number, I could round it to that area. And then once I change those things, it's going to yell at me and say, hey, the thing that is showing up on the screen here is not the exact same as what you typed. That is actually, it takes some time to get through these things, but there's a little arrow here which will let you update the view to match the constraints. So there, that one's kind of done. Good for it. Somehow or another in this process, I've managed to lose my other 2. I'm not quite sure why that happened. The nice thing is you can actually click on them in the outline that's over here and kind of get them back into the general ballpark. So I'm going to do similar things for him. So I'm going to make him center horizontal. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin him such that his width, his height, and his distance to the top thing are all right. So I'll just go ahead and add those 3 constraints. Since I typed in a number, I had the same problem as before. It's saying, hey, where you wanted it is not where it's at. I'm going to go ahead and fix this guy as well. So I'm going to drag him to the super view and say center horizontal. And then I'm going to pin him by adding a width, a height, and a top. Typically, you wouldn't specify a width and a height because you could let it just intrinsically wrap to the object. But for what I'm doing here, I actually wanted those buttons to be bigger. So I've kind of got those about where I want. And then what I can do is I can kind of see, what is it going to look like on different systems. So you can see that it looks pretty good on this iPhone, looks pretty good on that iPhone. You can also rotate these things. So if I wanted to rotate this and say, hey, what does it look like on a rotated iPhone? It actually looks pretty good. And so I could go ahead and run this now, and my first screen will visually look about right. So I've got it up, I've got it down. They don't actually do anything yet because I haven't connected them to code. So that's one of the things that I would like to fix. So let's go ahead and do that. So to connect it to code, I'm going to continue to use kind of my preview helper here, but instead of the preview, I'm going to switch it to the connection to the code. And so what I want to do is I want to start making connections between the view that you can see here and then the code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click drag or control drag from the button over, and I'm going to add an action for pressed count up. And then I'm also going to control drag from this guy and make an action for him for pressed count down. And then ultimately what I want to be changing is I want to be changing this view. So I'm going to add an outlet to him called my count label. Once I've made my connections, I'm actually kind of done with the graphical user interface. And what I can do is I can switch back to just looking at code, right? So much more easy to digest on one screen now, right? So what I've got is I've got some things that Xcode has done for me. You don't have to worry about all the details here yet. Just kind of know that there's a connection to a label, and then these two functions will get called whenever you click on the buttons. I'm going to make another variable called counter, and if somebody presses count up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take counter, I'm going to increment it, and then I'm going to take my count label, and I'm going to set its text equal to count equals, and then I'm going to use a thing called string interpolation to get my counter into the string there. So it's very similar to like what %d used to do in other languages. It's just a little bit cleaner. That's just kind of how Swift works. And then if I want count down to work the same, I can just say count minus minus. If this is the first time you'll see Swift, you'll notice that it starts to look a lot more like Python than Objective-C. There's no semicolons. There's a lot that's different about the language, right? So if I go ahead and run it now, what's going to happen is it's going to be using these rules that I've set, and it's going to actually be updating the label. So if I click on count up, you can see that the count goes up, and that's because when I click it, it's calling this function, which increments a variable, and then it updates the display. If I click on count down, it starts to go down. Looks like whenever I go into negative range, my label is not quite big enough. I'll just fix that real quick. And so what I really want to do is I just want to modify that width constraint. So if I want to, I can actually just click on that width constraint. And right now it's set to 104. Let's just change it to 140. Whenever you change a constraint in that way, it's kind of nice because you don't have to then update the view, whereas some of the other ways I did it, I had to update the view. So now whenever I count down, you can see that it goes into the negatives. All right, so that's buttons and labels. There's a ton of stuff you can do with buttons and labels. And I'll just go ahead and cut this off there with buttons and labels. See you next time.